A few years ago, I read a story about a couple who lived in Louisville, Clay and Velma Likens. Some of their family are part of our church family. Clay was a retired principal for Jefferson County, and Velma was a retired teacher at the time. It happened in 1992, and it was the night before Christmas when they stepped out onto their porch to turn off some Christmas lights, and they saw a large object wrapped in plastic at the end of the driveway, and they didn't know what it was. They went to find out, and as they unwrapped it, they discovered that it was a wicker chair that had been stolen from their front porch 18 years earlier. There was a note attached to the wicker chair. The note said, "To whom it may concern. Approximately 13 to 17 years ago, 18, my husband stole this wicker chair from the porch of this house. I'm ashamed of his behavior and I'm returning the stolen item. I have since been divorced from my husband and I have since been born again as a Christian. My life has completely changed and I am trying to undo any wrongdoing from the past to the best of my ability. I know this chair is not in the same condition as it was when it was stolen, and I apologize. I now live in another state, Tennessee, and I am rarely in the vicinity. I realize the cowardly fashion in which I'm returning this, but the reason is obvious. I will not bother you again. Please forgive us." The family took that rocker and they placed it inside the house. And they kept the note attached to it where it would become a treasured keepsake and a story that would be remembered. 18 years later, she knows she needs to make it right. She feels desperate to undo the wrongdoing. I think each of us understand what that place in life is like, at least to some degree, that even when we're born again, even when we feel like God has forgiven us, there's just something within us that says, I need to make things right. And certainly that can be a good response to God's forgiveness in our life, God's grace in our life, that we have a conviction to make things right. But I just can't help but picture this lady for 18 years walking past the wicker chair and feeling guilt and feeling shame and not wanting to sit in it. I just can't help but think of her driving from Tennessee to Louisville to return a chair 18 years later in an effort to make things right, to undo a wrongdoing. Today, as we study the book of Romans, Paul is going to talk to us about how we make things right, or more specifically, how we are made right through faith in Jesus. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the book of Romans in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. We're going to be in chapter 3, verse 21 and following. And we're in the third week of a series called The Bottom Line. And in this series, we're highlighting some key passages, not all, just some key passages in the book of Romans. And last week, we talked a little bit about the city of Rome, that it was this polytheistic culture where a lot of people worshiped many gods. In fact, the one thing that wasn't tolerated in Rome was the worship of one God. So you have Christianity and Judaism that are fiercely monotheistic, and that is not going over very good in Rome. And then you also had Rome as a very hedonistic culture where people just pursued pleasure. And we talked about last week how as a culture, we don't even come into a close second to the immorality and to the depravity that was taking place in Rome during this time. Nero was the emperor. He was brutal. He hated Christians. Eventually, that persecution would become quite severe. At this time, it's still in the early stages. Christianity was still kind of this fledgling movement. It didn't have a great amount of people, but it was going to grow, and it was going to become more significant. And so Nero would begin to be more severe in his persecution. So Paul is writing to these Christians in Rome about how to live out their faith in a very difficult time and a difficult place. These are first generation Christians, of course, so it wasn't passed down to them. They don't have a lot of examples to follow. They're learning what it means to follow Jesus, but there's a lot against them. And Paul writes to them this doctrinally complete book of Romans, helping them understand the foundation of their faith. He'd never been to Rome, so he's not reminding them of things he's already taught them. He's laying it out for them. So this passage we're going to look at, Martin Luther said that this paragraph is, quote, the chief point of not only this epistle, but of the entire Bible. So it's kind of a big deal. We're going to look at a few verses from this paragraph, starting in verse 21. We'll read here through verse 24, and then we'll look at a few other verses as we continue. So verse 21, Paul says, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known." So God's righteousness has been made known to us not by keeping the law or observing the law, but it's apart from the law, but it's a righteousness which the law and the prophets testify. So the law and the prophets of the Old Testament were pointing us towards this righteousness of God that Paul's going to tell us about. Verse 22, this righteousness is given. So it's not earned, it's given through faith in Christ to all who believe. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. For all have sinned, verse 23 says, and all fall short of the glory of God. We're all in the same boat. The ground is level. There's not one person that's more deserving than another. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, whether you've had a hedonistic past or a legalistic past. Everybody's in the same position here. We've all fallen short of God's glory, and we're all justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. So verse 21 is a really important transition in the book of Romans, and these two words mark that transition, but now. But now. So last week we looked at Romans 1, 16, 17, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, but then starting in verse 18 and going through chapter 3, verse 20, for 64 verses, Paul plays the part of a prosecuting attorney where he puts all of humanity on trial, and he is making it clear that we are all sinners. And some of us have sinned in more of the hedonistic ways, but then others have sinned by putting their hope in their own righteousness, but we're all sinners. We've all fallen short of God's glory, of God's standard, and so he lays out the case that there's not a single person who is deserving, that none of us are good enough to earn God's favor, none of us have done enough to save ourselves, that there are no scales out there, and that somehow at the end of time, if we've done more good than bad, God says, okay, you're in. Those don't exist. And so Paul, for these 64 verses leading up to this passage, says, look, there's a lot of bad news I'm going to have to lay out here. And he's just presented this undisputed evidence that we are all sinners. And then he transitions this in verse 21 with those two words, but now. And so he knows before we get to the good news, he has to give us some bad news. So that's what he's been doing. Imagine it this way. Imagine that I'm standing up here with a parachute, and I spend 30 minutes trying to convince you how much you need this parachute. And I tell some emotional stories about people who needed parachutes and they didn't have parachutes. And I explain how the parachute works. And I say to you, look, this parachute is yours. You only need to receive it. And chances are you wouldn't be very excited about the parachute. It wouldn't seem very relevant to you. The good news that I have a parachute for you, it wouldn't seem like very good news. Why? Because you're on the ground, right? If you're falling out of the sky, then that conversation goes much differently. But when you're on the ground, you can hear all day about, hey, I've got a parachute for you. It doesn't mean that much, but you change the context. You put us in a bad situation, and that news starts to sound a lot better, right? Like if you and I are in the back of a small plane, and we hear the pilot say, Mayday, we're going down, and the plane loses power, and you start to text, your hands are shaking, but you start to try to send a text to people you love saying goodbye, and this is it, and you know you won't survive, and I say to you, hey, I've got an extra parachute if you want it. Suddenly, that's really good news, right? Because things are bad, and the degree to which that news is good is dependent upon how bad the situation is. And so Paul spends all kinds of time saying things are bad. We are all sinners, and here's what we deserve because of our sin that has separated us from God. But now, verse 21. And what we try to do sometimes in the church is we try to present good news without the bad news, and the good news doesn't sound very good if the situation isn't understood to be bad, right? The degree of the news being good is based upon how bad the situation is. We understand this, that we're not nearly as excited about some new life-saving antidote or drug unless we or someone we love are the ones who have the illness. And you don't care that much about being offered a life jacket unless you're in the middle of an ocean on a sinking ship. And you don't care that much about being offered a glass of water. I mean, it's nice, but if you have been in the desert for a few days and you've had nothing to drink, then suddenly the news becomes very good. And so Paul is careful to spend some time helping us understand how bad the situation is. And then in verse 21, he says, but now. So as a church, we're going to talk often about the sinfulness of man and our struggles and our failures. But we will always do that in the context of the gospel, meaning that it's always pointing towards good news. It's helping us realize what God has done for us and how he has saved us. So Paul says, verse 21, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. The righteousness is given through faith in Jesus to all who believe. So Paul, for 64 verses, has said, no one is righteous. But now there is a righteousness apart from what you do. It's not earned, but it's given. That you are a passive recipient of something that is being done for you. And so let's talk about this word righteousness for a minute, because it's a word that we might use in church or in religious context, but maybe we don't really understand what it means. So when you hear righteousness, think in terms of proof of worth or proof of value. A couple of word pictures that might help us understand this word. One would be like an application. My daughter is a senior in high school. She's applied for some colleges, and as she applies for these colleges, they want to know that she is worthy of being accepted into the school. She has to be righteous enough. And so they'll ask her for, her transcript, her grades, and what are your test scores, and what are the experiences you've had, and what's some accomplishments? What are some accomplishments from the last 4 years of your life? And they are wanting to see whether or not she will be accepted into the school. She has to prove her righteousness. Another idea would be when you're applying for a job, you put your resume together, and that resume is proof of your worth. It's proof of your value. That's your righteousness that will get you in to that job position. Or when you apply for a loan in your credit application, you're saying that I am worthy of being given this loan. And so when we hear the word righteousness, that's the idea, that we have earned it, that we have the value, we have the worth. And so Paul has made the case that none of us are righteous in our own efforts. So he's basically spent these few chapters in Romans writing a rejection letter, saying, no, you're not good enough. You've not been accepted. Your application has been denied. But now there is this righteousness that is from God. Not that you've earned it by keeping all the rules and following all the laws, but it's something that has been given to you from God through faith in Jesus. It's not based on your moral record. It's not based on your religious resume. It is from God. Now look, this is what separates Christianity from literally every other religious system. This is what makes the gospel not just different, but the gospel is opposite of all these other religious systems. And so you could just kind of go through the major religions. The Buddhist's eightfold path is based on an individual's performance, and the Hindu doctrine of karma that determines a person's destiny is based on certain accomplishments about good outweighing bad. A Muslim would have a very strict code of law that would have to be followed in order to be worthy of entering paradise. All of them are based upon your own righteousness, that you are worth it, that you have earned it. But there's obscure religions all over the world that maybe you've never heard of before, but this is true of all of them. I was reading about the Lakota warriors who fasten an eagle claw to their chest, and then they strap the other end to this sacred pole, and they fling themselves outward until the claw rips through their skin, and then they enter a sweat lodge until the temperature is at an unbearable heat as a way to atone for their sins, as a way to make themselves right with the God they serve. And so the gospel isn't just different, the gospel is opposite of those things. Because the gospel doesn't say to earn it, it says you can't earn it. It's a gift that's given. The gospel doesn't say you need to do more and more. The gospel says it's about what's been done for you. And it's a completely different understanding of faith than any other religious system would have. And even for many of you who are listening to this, it's very upside down from what you understood growing up in church, because oftentimes the church will use guilt and will use shame and fear as a way to try to get people to live a certain way and do certain things. And so some of you came to church growing up, and your understanding was, I'm not good enough, I need to do more, and if I could do more good, if the good could outweigh the bad, if I could just be a better person, then God would accept me. That's not the gospel. The gospel says, you can't possibly do enough good. You can't earn your way. You'll never be righteous enough on your own. It is a gift that comes from God through faith in Jesus. Verse 22 says it's through faith in Christ to all who believe. This is for everyone, because verse 23 helps us understand, reminds us that everyone is in the same position. Everyone needs it. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned is this archery term. It's this idea of missing a target that's been set up, that God has set up a target and no one hit it. No one hit it. And close doesn't count. Like you think, well, I got closer to the target than the people around me. No, it's not how it works, right? No one has hit the target. We've all fallen short. We're all in the same position. 2 weeks ago, I went with my wife to this mud run at Perfect North in Cincinnati that she had signed us up for a few months earlier and that I had completely forgotten about until a day or two before. And so it was this 4-mile mud run with like 50 obstacles, and it was a lot of fun. It was humbling for me. I'm not gonna lie, like she would make these comments about how it was a beautiful day and it was a relaxing and leisurely pace that we were going at, and I was pretending like I had a rock in my shoe so I could pull over and wait till my side ache went away. And so it was a humbling thing for me. I knew she would win, but it was hard to keep up. But we went on this mud run. Here's a picture of us when it was all over. And this is me saying, hey, this is her idea. And yes, she won. But before the race began, we were in line. We were talking to some folks, and these ladies in front of us, they had this idea that they could, if they really worked at it, not get muddy on the mud run. Well, it's a mud run, so maybe you should expect to get muddy. But in their minds, they were kind of thinking, if we navigate it carefully enough, if we kind of go around some obstacles, there's probably some ways that we can make it through this mud run without getting muddy. And 5 minutes into it, we're army crawling through 2 feet of thick mud, and I'm thinking of them and enjoying the moment, right? Like it makes me feel better about me knowing that they're somewhere behind me, army crawling through this mud, and they're covered in it too. After the race is over, they had these huge showers out in the parking lot, where literally like hundreds of people would be showering. I wasn't particularly excited about that, right? And yet, by the time you're done with it, you're so muddy, you don't care. I threw my shirt away, I threw my shoes and my socks away, threw them in the trash. I spent 30 minutes, surrounded by people in these showers trying to get the mud off me. I spent the next 3 days Q-tipping mud out of the deep recesses of my inner ear, and I had mud in places I didn't even know I had places. You're just covered in it, so you're just covered in it. And when you're all in there getting that off of you at the same time, you realize it doesn't matter, right? Like, I might look at a few people and think, well, I didn't get as muddy as they got muddy, but I'm covered in mud. It wouldn't make any sense for somebody to finish that and look around and say, well, I think I'm okay. I've got a wedding to get to. I mean, just compared to everybody else, I think I'm all right. No, everybody's in the same position. Everybody's dirty. Everybody needs a shower. It's true for everybody. And the Bible talks about the fact that we're all in this same position. We're all dirty. In fact, the Bible talks about how even our righteous acts are as filthy rags before God. Now, even these things that we do, that we feel good about, we think make us right, even those things are filthy rags before God. Why? Because when we're doing them, our motive is off, it's wrong, we're feeling superior to other people, it's marked with pride and self-righteousness, and so even the good things we do are bad things. They are as filthy rags before God. And so Paul says, look, we're all in the same position. We're all in need of being cleansed, and we can't cleanse ourselves. We've all fallen short of God's standard. Around 10 or 11 years ago, I was meeting with a couple after church. The wife had become a Christian, and the husband had been attending some. But he was skeptical, and he was cynical, and I met with them, and I was sharing the gospel with them, and I got to this verse in Romans 3:23 that says, all have sinned, and all have fallen short of God's standard, all have fallen short of God's glory. And when I got to that, he was defensive about it. He said, look, I'm not that bad of a person. Most people would consider me a good man. And he didn't think it was fair that he was going to be judged by God's standard. He said, how fair is it to set up a standard that no one can meet and then hold people accountable to it? The word picture he used, he said, it's like setting up a target that's out of range and then blaming the shooter for not being able to hit it. It's entrapment. It's not fair. It's not fair. I'm a good person, and it's not fair that God sets up this standard. And I was getting ready to kind of give a theological explanation for some of this, and his wife jumped in and said to us, can I say something? And she was gentle, but we understood that this was a rhetorical question, like she was going to say something. And so she said to her husband, do you think it's okay? She was humble. She said, do you think it's okay to get drunk and yell at your spouse? Do you think it's okay to lie about your numbers at work? Do you think it's okay to tell your grandson you're going to come to his game and then not show up at his game? And she asked several other personal questions that were clearly indicting. And then she said something, and I just never had thought of it this way before. She said, you say it's not fair to be held to God's standard, but you fall short of your own standards. In other words, let's just set this aside for a moment, this whole God standard thing. Let's just talk about our own standards. But even by our own standards, if we were honest, we would have to admit that we have fallen short, that we are, even by our own standards, we are sinners.